One night in the summer of 1921, a young man named Carl Logies walked across the farm that he had recently purchased in rural Ohio. He was on his way to check on his horses and his cattle one last time before he went to bed. He had a gun on his hip and a lantern in the other hand, and as he walked across the farm, he sort of looked out at the farmhouse and the barn up ahead and the water well and all this land, and he couldn't help but feel really proud of what he had. I mean, this was all his. So Carl had always dreamed of having this, of having his own farm. And he'd been able to get this one for a really low price because apparently the people who owned it before him had been very eager to get rid of it. And he had seen it as a great opportunity. Now, Carl didn't really know why they wanted to move it so badly, but he didn't care. It just meant he got a great deal. And so Carl continued walking over to the barn where his cattle and his horses were. And as he got closer, keep in mind it's dark out, it's late at night, he suddenly felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. And he had this unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. But Carl, he lives alone. It's just him and his animals. Like, there's no reason there would be anybody nearby to watch him. And so instinctively, Carl stops where he is and he whips around and he shines his lantern in all directions, just seeing if there's somebody there, but there's nobody. Granted, his field of vision is pretty limited. I mean, it's dark outside, his lantern's not that bright, but for the most part, he can tell that there's no one in the immediate vicinity. He's all alone. And so then his thought is, well, is there a predator nearby? I mean, is there an animal watching me? But Carl, he's looking around and it's a peaceful, quiet night. And, the previous owners certainly hadn't mentioned any risk of predators in the area. And so Carl tells himself, he's just being paranoid. He's new to this property. He doesn't really know what it's like to be here. And so he tells himself, you're just overthinking it. Go to the barn, take care of your animals, and just go to bed. Everything is fine. And so Carl turns around and he walks over to the barn. He goes inside and he kind of busies himself getting the horses and the cattle ready for the night. And, he's in there for a few minutes. And for the most part, he's forgotten about that strange feeling he had when he came over, that feeling of being watched. But after he was wrapping up, he couldn't help but start to feel like he had that feeling again, that there was somebody watching him. And so he's looking out his barn door and he doesn't see anything, but it's dark out there and he's kind of looking around the inside of his barn. And again, he's telling himself that you're being paranoid, everything is fine. But admittedly, deep down, Carl was feeling pretty nervous about just this walk he was going to have to make through the darkness across his property back over to the farmhouse. But, he steeled his resolve. He grabbed his lantern and he checked his gun on his hip. And then he walked out the doors of his barn and began quickly making his way towards his house. And as he's walking, he's kind of scanning both sides, checking to make sure nobody's out here, and he's not seeing anyone. And right as he's about halfway to his house, something catches his eye on the far side of the property, something kind of off in the distance. And he stops and he aims his lantern in that direction, which doesn't really illuminate that much, but it illuminates enough to see that there's actually somebody standing on his property. And he's so alarmed by it, he just stands there holding his lantern, looking at this person, and it's like this white silhouette just standing there still, looking right over at Carl. They're sort of in the vicinity of his water well. And after being frozen for a second, Carl kind of snapped out of it and he said, hey, who are you? What are you doing here? And this figure doesn't move, doesn't react. They just stand there kind of staring at Carl, and then they turn and begin kind of moving away from Carl in the direction of the water well. And Carl, at this point, he doesn't know what's happening. He thinks that this person clearly is some sort of trespasser. They must have been here earlier. That's what I was feeling. They were here. They've been watching me. Are they gonna try to rob me? Who is this? And so he draws his gun and he starts chasing after this person. And as he's running, his lantern's waving back and forth. And as he's running, he loses sight of this white figure. And by the time he actually gets to the water well, he realizes he's lost this person. They're just gone. At this point, Carl really didn't know what to make of this. He didn't know where this person went. He has no idea if they've doubled back around and they're gonna try to go in his house at some point here. He does not understand what's happened or where they've gone. He doesn't know who they are. And so all he can think to do as he's standing there by the well, out of breath, from running there, is just to yell out that, he's got a gun and he's not afraid to use it and don't you dare come back here. But despite yelling out these sort of open-ended threats into the darkness, there's no response. And he doesn't see this white figure anywhere. It's just dark and silent in all directions. And so for a while, Carl just stood there at the well, just, looking out, almost expecting to see this figure reappear, but they never did. And eventually, when it really felt like everything had kind of calmed down on his property, he just turned and run the rest of the way over to his farmhouse. He went inside and locked the door behind him. Now, the next morning when Carl woke up, he tried to tell himself that whatever happened the night before, it had to be an anomaly. Like maybe that was a neighbor who had come over and they were shy, or maybe it was, a potential trespasser or a thief or something, and they were scared off by Carl's threats of being willing to use his weapon. Like Carl is telling himself that whatever that was last night, he likely would never encounter that person ever again, and it was handled. But Carl was wrong. Almost every single night from that night onward for the next year, at about 9:30 p.m. every night around the time that Carl would go to the barn to check on his animals before bed, he would always see that figure. And they were never close enough that Carl could actually see who it was or get any sense of what they wanted. They were always just kind of off on the side of the property, always watching Carl every time he came out of the barn. And then when he would invariably scream at them and run towards them, and even at one point he fired his weapon in their direction, every time this figure would just, without saying anything, move away from Carl in the direction of the water well. And around there, Carl would lose sight of them. They would just vanish. Now, as much as Carl really wanted to pretend that this was just something explainable, that this was some person coming on his property that was evading his capture every single night, as much as he wished that could be the explanation, Carl knew, despite not being a very superstitious or, a believer in the paranormal, despite not being those things, he felt like what he was witnessing was a ghost. I mean, what else could it be? It's this white figure that floats away from him and vanishes every night. Like, that's a ghost. And also, another part of Carl was thinking, like, the previous owners were really excited to sell this property effectively at a loss. It's like they just wanted to be rid of this property. And he couldn't help but feel like, maybe there's a connection between what I'm seeing and why they left. But the one thing that Carl hung on to was that despite how unsettling this whole thing was and how terrifying it was to, see this figure floating around on his property, despite that, the reality is it was pretty predictable. Every night around 9:30, he would see this ghost, whatever it was, but it didn't really affect him or his animals. It was just terrifying. And he accepted that. It just sort of became his new normal. That is, until August 1st of 1922, which happened to be almost exactly a year after Carl had purchased this property. On that day, Carl noticed his horses, his cattle, they stopped drinking the water, the well water that he gave them all year long since he had been here. They had never had any issues with it, but on that day, they just stopped drinking it. And in fact, they were kind of skittish around the water, like there was something in the water that was upsetting them. Carl tasted the water, it tasted fine to him, but he assumed there just must be something in it that made it unclean to the animals. And so what he had to do was clean the water, which meant he needed to drain the well, get rid of all this dirty water, and let the well refill, and hopefully at that point it will be clean. So Carl goes over to the water well. Remember, this is always where the figure goes off and disappears to. And as the water began to drain, he realized there was something in the well, clearly deep in the well that he never would have been able to see unless he drained it. And here he is draining it, and he's looking down and he can't quite tell what it is, but eventually the water was shallow enough that it was obvious what was in the bottom of his well. And at that point, he went and got the sheriff. It would turn out 5 years earlier, Carl's farm had been owned by another man whose name was Frank Lerman. And Frank, when he was here, had multiple employees, including a young farmhand named Henry Leipenstick. And one day, Henry had gone missing. Henry didn't have any family or close friends who lived nearby, and so basically everybody in town assumed that Henry must have just left town. But one of Frank's neighbors had told the sheriff at the time that she didn't actually believe that. She thought maybe Frank himself had done something to Henry, because according to her, Frank and Henry argued all the time about money. Like there was clearly real tension between those two. The sheriff tried to look into Frank to see if there was any legitimacy to this claim. But at the same time this investigation was beginning, Frank abruptly sold his property and moved away. And without any real evidence, the sheriff couldn't prove there was any foul play involved. And so he just had to close the case and move on. Until Carl, 5 years later, drained that well. And suddenly, the Henry Lipenstick case was solved. Because at the bottom of the well, Carl found Henry's very decomposed body. He was practically skeletal by this point, but they could tell that was Henry. An autopsy later revealed that Henry had died of blunt force trauma to the head, and his death was ruled a homicide. Frank was arrested and found guilty of second-degree murder, but he only served 7 months before his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, and he was released. When they pulled Henry's remains out of the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was wearing a watch, and the watch had stopped at 9:35 p.m., precisely the time that Carl, for a whole year, saw that white figure running off, disappearing over towards the water well where Henry's body was located. After Henry's body was properly buried, Carl never saw that white figure ever again. Also, it's believed that the previous owners right before Carl, who sold him the property at a discount, likely they were selling it because they too had seen Henry's ghost. Happy New Year, everybody. And to celebrate this new year, I actually have a pretty huge announcement. So beginning this Monday and going forward, we're going old school on this channel. We're going back to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. And this is none of that oh, we edited it differently, so it's brand new. No, we're talking new content up to 4 times a week. So how will it actually work? Well, this week, you're gonna be getting new stories on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and of course, Saturday. Saturday is the same as it's always been and will continue to be. And then each and every week after that, you're gonna be getting 2, 3, even 4 brand new Mrballen episodes every single week. You've told me that you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and now you're gonna get it. Can't wait to see you guys. Thank you. Late one night in the winter of 1933, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg poured another round of drinks for all of his buddies who were sitting inside of one of Anton's many sitting rooms inside of his huge castle that he owned in southern Poland. And after pouring these drinks, Anton kind of clumsily began walking his way over to the table where his buddies were, and because Anton was pretty drunk, because he and his friends had been drinking for hours and playing cards and partying, Anton stumbled at some point and basically spilled half of the drinks onto the carpet. But because he was so drunk, he just thought it was really funny. And so did his friends. They were all roaring with laughter as he's on the carpet, picking up all these basically empty glasses. But then instead of going back and re-pouring the drinks, Anton, sort of as a joke, walked over to the table, sat down, and handed out these basically empty cups to his friends. And everybody thought it was so funny, and they didn't even get up to get more drinks. They were just all so drunk and happy, they just kept on playing their card game. And so as Anton's sitting there and everyone's laughing and smiling, the friend of his that was the dealer for this round of blackjack began to deal, but as he did, there was this sudden, really loud creaking sound that came from right above them. And it was so loud and so pronounced that even amongst this loud room of drunk men playing cards, everybody heard it. And there was a moment of silence where everyone sort of registered like, what's going on above us? And in this sudden stillness, Anton, he sort of made a jest and he goes, oh boy, that's the monk. Now, for the most part, everybody at the table, all of Anton's friends that were there, they had heard the story of the so-called hooded monk that apparently haunted the castle. That's at least what Anton would say. But one person who was there that night was a new friend of Anton's, and they had not heard of, the monk's story. And they said, well, what are you talking about? That's the monk. And immediately everyone's like, oh, geez, here we go. Because Anton, he looked over at the friends and he was like, oh, you haven't heard the story of the hooded monk? Let me tell you. And then Anton basically told this friend, as the rest of the friends are all like, give me a break, this is just crap, this is not real. But Anton would tell this person, this newbie, that when he took ownership of this huge castle, he was told that everything's fine, except there's one bedroom upstairs that's totally off limits, because apparently it is haunted by a hooded monk, an evil hooded monk that sort of patrols this room. And Anton told this friend that he actually had never gone in that bedroom because he believed the story was true, that maybe, just maybe, there really was a malevolent spirit, a hooded monk figure that was in there. And also, he had tons of bedrooms in his castle. He didn't need to go in there, but, right above us is that off-limits bedroom, and so maybe that creak we heard was the monk. Now, again, basically everybody in the room knew this story, because Anton loved to tell the story of how his castle was haunted. But that's all it ever was. It was just some story that Anton told. But this friend, when they heard this from Anton, their reaction was, wait a minute, you have a bedroom in this castle that you own that you literally haven't gone inside of because there's a ghost in there? Are you kidding me? You literally haven't gone in that room for that reason? And as they said it out loud, all of Anton's other friends sort of picked up on how cowardly it seemed for Anton to have never gone in. Suddenly this story just made it seem like Anton was just kind of a coward. And everybody just piled on. They're like, yeah, Anton, why haven't you gone in there? Come on, man, this is your castle. Go in that bedroom. And before long, Anton was no longer happy to be talking about the story. He was like, oh yeah, just forget about it, guys. Let's get back to our game. But nobody would let it go until finally they dared him hey, not only should you go in there, but tonight, you should stay the night in that bedroom to show us that you're really not afraid. And eventually, because Anton was so drunk and he was sort of standing up for his pride, he finally said, fine, fine. I'll go in there and I'll spend the night. Fine, I'll show you that this is just a story, it's no big deal. Now, after Anton loosely agreed to this, he likely thought that, the guys will forget about this and we'll go back to playing cards, and by the end of the night, nobody's gonna make sure I really go into that bedroom tonight. They're gonna forget about this. But no, the friends would not let this go. And at the end of the night, when they had kind of wound down their card game and everybody was feeling pretty tired, they all were like, okay, Anton, we're gonna walk you up to your bedroom to make sure you sleep inside of that haunted room. And because Anton had already publicly declared that he wasn't afraid and he would do it, he was like, okay, let's go. And so the group, with Anton in the lead, they left the sitting room and they went up the stairs to the second floor, and they go down the hallway to the bedroom where supposedly, this hooded monk ghost resided. And the door, it wasn't barred up or anything, but again, Anton had never been in there, but he had grabbed the key. And Anton, he goes up and he sort of nervously unlocks the door, and then before pushing it open, he turns and looks at his friends and he's like, all right, I'm going in, trying to see if they really wanted him to do it. And all his friends are sort of looking at him sort of hesitantly, but they're like, yeah, go inside, go, do it. And Anton's like, all right. And he pushes the door open, and he and his friends, they all look inside. For the first time, Anton is now laying eyes on the inside of this bedroom. And really, there was not much to see. I mean, it was a bedroom, and there was old furniture in there that looked like it had been there for hundreds of years, covered in dust, and there's cobwebs everywhere, but it basically just looked like a really old bedroom that nobody used. And so his friends are like, all right, Anton, get in there. And Anton's like, all right, I'll see you in the morning. And he goes inside the room and he shuts the door. And then the friends, they all walked back down the hall, went into their respective bedrooms where they were sleeping, and everybody went to bed. Several hours later, in the middle of the night, as all the friends are all asleep, there's this sudden, extremely loud, blood-curdling scream that appeared to be coming from the bedroom where Anton was, inside the haunted room. And so the friends, they jump out of bed, they run into the hallway, they go down the hall, and they get to the door and they try to open it, the room that Anton's in, but it's locked. And they start banging on the door, yelling, Anton, are you okay? Are you okay? Because even though they had put him up to this, they had dared him to do this, they didn't really think there was any risk, but at the same time, maybe there was something bad in there, so they're worried. They're worried about Anton. They want to make sure he's okay. But after pounding and yelling on the door, there was no response. The haunted bedroom where Anton was completely silent. And the friends, they all kind of exchanged worried glances, and they're like, we got to get in there. We got to make sure he's okay. Something just feels wrong. That scream, that's somebody in danger. Anton could be hurt here. And so they began smashing this door, ramming into it, until finally they literally blew the door off its hinges. And when they looked into the room and saw what was going on, they couldn't believe it. When Anton went into the bedroom to spend the night, his friends would recall hearing the sound of him turning the key and locking the bedroom door behind him. So Anton is in this haunted bedroom and he's locked inside, and there's no other way in or out of this bedroom. So he is in there totally alone and he's locked the door. So keep that in mind. So now, a few hours later, after hearing the scream, the friends blow the door open, literally knock it off its hinges because it was locked, and they find Anton. And he's dead. and he's laying on the bed on his back, and the only sign of something that happened to him is there's this red mark around his neck, like a ligature mark, a thin red ligature mark around his neck. But there's no rope or line anywhere in the room. There's no sign of a struggle. There's nothing else really in this room except for Anton. And he's just inexplicably dead with this mark on his neck. Authorities got involved and they searched the room top to bottom, and they never found any rope or any line, nothing that could have left those marks on his neck. And they also did an autopsy on Anton, but they couldn't figure out what his cause of death was. So just the fact that Anton died in this really inexplicable way in a bedroom that he claimed was haunted is pretty mysterious. But it becomes even more mysterious when you consider the whole story about this ghost that haunted this castle. So Anton, when he would typically tell the story, would just basically say, well, there's this evil hooded monk that is upstairs in one of the bedrooms, and that's why I don't go in it. And that's kind of the whole story. But that's not the whole story. That's just kind of the version that Anton would tell. The whole story was, this castle has been haunted for hundreds of years. There is an evil monk that lives in that bedroom upstairs, and if you go in there, the evil monk will kill you by strangling you with a thin rope. That's the story. And so it really makes you wonder, because to this day, nobody knows how Anton Holberg died alone in that locked bedroom after seemingly being strangled by a rope that didn't exist. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, January 20th, 1907, a 57-year-old man named Samuel Hughes was riding on a passenger train that was moving through southeastern Wales. Sam had spent basically the last 24 hours working the entire time. He was a salt merchant, and he had left the town where he lived, a town called Blackwood, and taken a train south about an hour to another town called Newport, where he did a lot of business. And basically all day Saturday, from early morning all the way until late at night, he had been working. And now finally, 1 a.m. on Sunday, he's back on a train heading back to his town in Blackwood. But despite how utterly exhausted he was on this ride back home, barely able to keep his eyes open, Sam was just so relieved that soon, very soon, he would get off the train, he'd be back in his house, and he could just collapse in bed. And so that's all he's thinking about. And so for a little bit longer, Sam is, fighting to keep his eyes open, and the train's rumbling along, and he can tell he's getting close to home. I mean, he rides this train all the time. This is a pretty, regular route for him. And then finally, Sam feels the train start to slow down, at which point he gathers up all his things. He gets up and kind of shuffles his way into the hall. And then once the train came to a full stop, he stepped off the train onto the platform, relieved that, he's now maybe 10 minutes from home. But as the train took off from the station, Sam, who's again standing on this platform, it's late at night here, he's looking around and he realizes something. In his stupor, in his exhaustion, he didn't realize this was not his stop. He had gotten off one stop too early. It was like he was on autopilot. He was so tired, he got off thinking he was home, but he wasn't. And now the train is gone. And remember, this is the early 1900s. He didn't have a quick way to get from where he was to his home. Like, there wasn't going to be another train anytime soon, nor did he know the train schedule. He also didn't have a way to call a cab or anything. It's 1, 2 in the morning here. And so Sam realizes he basically can either find a place to stay in whatever town this is, or he can basically walk to Blackwood, which is, a pretty good walk away, but he figured, maybe, this town was close enough he could do it. And so he figured, his first step here is just leave the platform and just go find somebody, anybody in town that maybe is out and about, and just kind of figure out where we are. How do I get to Blackwood? Is there a hotel nearby or an inn or something? But he needs to go find somebody. And so even though Sam at this point is furious with himself and really just wants to spend time dwelling on the fact that he's made this mistake, he's sort of over that, and he's just focused on finding a solution. And so Sam leaves the platform and he starts walking, in the general direction of lights that he sees off in the distance. But this is a small train platform. He's clearly not near any major city. It's pretty much dark and just rural roads going in different directions. And so he really does not have high hopes that he's gonna run into anybody anytime soon. But surprisingly, after leaving the platform and walking not very far, he got to an intersection where he saw another person walking up the other street. And he quickly realized it was a police officer. And so Sam is like so relieved, an authority figure, they can help me. And he flags down the police officer, and the officer comes over and, they're kind of sizing up Sam, like, what are you doing out here? It's the middle of the night. You got luggage with you. Like, what's going on here? And Sam explained the mistake he had made and asked the officer, like, hey, is there a place to stay here? Or maybe, is it walkable to get to my town, Blackwood? And the officer would tell him, like, there is places to stay in this town, but if you're up for it, it would only take you, maybe an hour if you did want to make the walk to Blackwood. And, if I was in your shoes, I might do that. And Sam, he thought about it and he was like, you know what? I just want to get home. I want to get in my own bed. So yes, just point me in the right direction. And so the officer, he explained to Sam that luckily it's really simple. You just basically go straight down that road and you walk for about an hour until you reach a bridge. Once you get over the bridge, follow some signs and it'll be really obvious that you're right near Blackwood and you'll make it the rest of the way. And so Sam thanked the officer and then gathered up his things and he began walking in the direction of his town. Several hours later, a little after 3 a.m., Sam's wife, Bess, was awake inside of their home in Blackwood. She was awake because she was waiting for Sam to get home. She knew he would have a long day in Newport, but by now she knew he should be home. I mean, he went on this trip fairly regularly. She knew how long it took, even on the long end. And it being 3 a.m. and him not being home was starting to be pretty concerning. And so she's up, she's kind of anxious. And all of a sudden, she hears Sam calling out to her. He's clearly out in front of the property. He must have known that she was awake. He could see the lights on inside the house, and he was calling out to her that, he was returning. And so Bess, she's overcome with relief. She knows her husband is safe. She grabs a candle and she goes to the front door to greet her husband. She opens the door and she looks out, and it's not her husband. Her husband is nowhere to be found. Instead, there is this dark figure standing on her porch, just inches away, looking right at Bess. And Bess, she freezes when she sees it, but she isn't scared. There's a weird calm about what she's looking at. She doesn't know what it is. She has no idea what to do, but she's just standing there calm as this figure is right in front of her, not moving. And as she's just staring at it, she realizes it's dressed in this long black cloak, and it had on a black silk hat. And her husband always wore a black silk hat. And she knew specifically he had worn it that morning when he went to Newport. And so for a minute, she's just staring sort of unbelievably at this apparition, apparently wearing clothes, at least a hat, that belonged to her husband. And she knows she just heard her husband call to her. She didn't imagine that. He just called to her. But then Bess blinked and the figure just vanished. The hat, the cloak, it's all just gone. And there's nobody standing on her porch. And now Bess is scared. Because as much as there was a calm about this figure, now she's thinking, like, did I just imagine that? Like, what's going on here? Is my husband outside somewhere? Did he call to me because he's hurt or something? And so she leaves her house with this candle and she's running around her house calling out for Sam, but Sam's not out there. And so eventually Bess goes back inside the house and just continues to sit up waiting for Sam. But Sam doesn't come home. And eventually, by 5 or 6 in the morning, Bess just goes to bed. When Bess woke up later that afternoon, Sam still had not come home yet. But now, the sun is out and she's telling herself that weird thing that happened last night, she must have imagined that, like that didn't happen. And, Sam's fine, he'll be home. He's stayed late before and not told me, like everything's okay. But as Bess is reassuring herself that everything's okay, she hears a knock on the front door. And for a second, she thinks maybe it's Sam, maybe he's home. But she goes to the door, she opens it up, and it's a police officer. And he just says to her, I have some terrible news. It would turn out the night before, when Sam met that police officer who told him to walk this way to get back to Blackwood, well, Sam had followed the directions, and apparently he was on the right path because he got all the way to that bridge that the officer said would, demarcate that he was close to Blackwood. But perhaps because he was so exhausted, or maybe just because it was still so dark outside, he fell off the bridge to his death. And so the police officer is telling Bess this, and she's totally overcome with grief. But then for whatever reason, her mind immediately went to that dark figure she saw on the porch a little after 3 a.m. And without really thinking this through, she just said to the officer, what time do you think he died? And the officer was like, well, based on the officer that directed Samuel in that direction, towards the bridge and how long it would have taken him to get there, we estimate he likely fell off the bridge around 3 a.m. And so for Bess, she's thinking, that's around the same time I saw that figure on my porch. And then she also began to think about that hat, the black silk hat that Sam always wore, that she knew he had worn that morning when he went to Newport. And so Bess's next question was, well, when you found him, was he wearing his black silk hat? And the officer was kind of confused and said, no, he wasn't wearing a hat at all. And so when Bess heard that, those details confirmed that who or what she saw on her porch earlier that morning, the dark figure with the black silk hat, that must have been Sam's soul. He was coming to say goodbye to his wife because he had just fallen off the bridge and died. And, this figure having that black silk hat on was a way of showing her that, yes, that really was her husband. Bess would later tell this story to a reporter who would have this story printed all over Wales, and that's how we know it today. Early on the morning of August 19th, 1991, a 32-year-old man named Bobby Curley stood in his recently renovated kitchen in the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He walked over to his fridge, opened it up, reached inside, and grabbed his bag lunch along with his thermos, and he was just about to head out the door and go to work, but he stopped and gave his wife Joanne a kiss on the cheek and said he loved her, and then he left for the day. So Bobby and Joanne had been married for a year, and they lived with Joanne's 4-year-old daughter, Angela, in a duplex in a working-class neighborhood. Bobby was an electrician, and so he made pretty good money, but the Curleys were by no means rich. However, Bobby knew that actually might change soon, because Joanne was on the verge of winning this big court settlement. Joanne had actually been married once before, but her husband had died in a car accident about 3 years ago. His car had collided with a tractor trailer, and the driver of that tractor trailer was eventually found to be the one at fault. And so now, Joanne's lawyers and the trucking company's lawyers were finally closing in on a financial settlement to compensate Joanne for her first husband's wrongful death. It had been a really stressful process, and Bobby had definitely noticed that Joanne had been more sullen and stressed than usual as they were going through it. But now that the case was finally wrapping up, Joanne did appear to be sort of back in good spirits, and, while nothing was official yet, it looked like they were going to receive approximately $1 million in compensation, which was obviously really exciting. In fact, the two of them were already mapping out how they might spend some of this money. Some of the ideas they had come up with included taking Angela on a few big trips, and also maybe using some of that money to finally fund Bobby having his own business, something he had always wanted to do, but lacked the resources for. But for now, the settlement was not complete, and so Bobby had to go to his normal 9 to 5 and, punch the clock and keep earning money for the family. So for today, once he was outside, he simply got into his car and made the short drive to his current job site. 10 minutes later, Bobby parked outside of a science building on the campus of Wilkes University, which was a small college in Wilkes-Barre. He saw some of the guys on his crew standing out front, waiting to be let into this building. So Bobby, who was the foreman of their crew, he got out of his car and said good morning to everyone and then walked up and unlocked the doors. Then they all went inside and got to work. And working at this location had really become a pretty big routine for this group, because by now Bobby and his crew had been coming here, working here for a few months now. And this job was a really big job. Bobby and his team were helping renovate the entire building, which included all the classrooms, all the laboratories, hallways, everything. And so they still had quite a bit of work to do. But there was another reason this job was taking as long as it was. And that was because when Bobby's crew had first shown up at the building, they had expected it to be totally prepared for them, meaning all furniture and equipment would be cleared out. But instead, they found a ton of stuff just kind of everywhere inside the building, because the building clearly had not been prepped at all. The chemistry lab, for example, still had random flasks and chemical bottles and, wet rags with weird substances on them just laying around the room. So as a result, Bobby and his crew had been forced to do a ton of cleanup, before they even got into their jobs that they had not planned on, and it really set them back. And so now, just to stay on schedule, they were regularly putting in 12-hour days basically every day they were there. And so all these extra hours had Bobby feeling completely exhausted and lately he had sort of felt kind of sick almost, and he just sort of chalked that up to basically overworking. But Bobby never complained. The overtime pay was great, and he really enjoyed working with these particular guys on this crew. These guys were basically his friends. So normally, the long work days were actually kind of fun, as exhausting and awful as they were. Later that afternoon, Bobby was standing on a ladder inside of that chemistry lab, running electrical wires above the ceiling panels. And as he was doing that, he suddenly heard this loud commotion coming from across the room. Bobby realized what he was hearing were guys on his crew basically shouting and laughing. So he climbed down to see what was going on. And when he walked over there, he saw that everybody was gathered around one of the members of the crew, whose name was Sammy DePasquale. And Sammy was sort of doubled over, coughing and spitting and holding a Coke can in his hand. Another member of the crew, whose name was Robert Marconi, explained to Bobby when he walked over that somebody had swapped out Sammy's Coke with a different Coke can, one that was filled with chewing tobacco spit instead of soda. Bobby cringed. This was absolutely disgusting. Even as a prank, this was awful. But it was also sort of par for the course for the guys on Bobby's crew. This is sort of what they did. They were always playing pranks on each other to kind of lighten the mood on long work days like today. And everybody was laughing, even Sammy, who'd been the butt of the joke. And so eventually, Bobby joined in too. He thought that this was ultimately good for morale, as gross as it was. And after a minute or so, Sammy recovered from his coughing fit from drinking this disgusting liquid and vowed sort of comically to get payback on whoever switched his Coke can. Then after that, all the guys got back to work. And so Bobby, he left the group and went back over to his ladder. And as he was climbing back up, he paused about halfway because he felt this sudden wave of sickness come over him. It almost felt like he had a flu coming on, which didn't really surprise him because he had been doing all these overtime hours and he really had felt run down as a result of it. And so again, he's just sort of chalking up the way he feels to overworking. And so as Bobby is standing on this ladder, he kind of told himself, just suck it up, this will pass. And he just stood there on the ladder. And after a minute or two, that sensation of being sick did sort of pass. And then, because he was not a complainer, he was a hardworking guy, he just pushed the sickness feeling he was having out of his mind. He climbed back up and got back to doing his wiring. But 4 days later, on the morning of Friday, August 23rd, Bobby felt worse than ever. As he made his way across the college parking lot towards the science building where his crew was still working, he felt like his feet were heavy and he was constantly short of breath. And then as the workday went on, continuing to run wires in that chem lab, Bobby got really sweaty and really hot. His coworkers noticed and kept coming up to him to ask if he needed to go home early. But even though Bobby totally did need to go home early and felt awful, he would just tell them nope, he was just fine. And so Bobby would manage to get through that particular workday. But then at the end of the day, when it was time to go home, Bobby felt so relieved. He could not wait to just get home, crawl into bed, and sleep. But by the next morning, Saturday morning, that heavy feeling in Bobby's feet had turned into this really intense burning pain that actually went all the way up his legs. And then his hands went numb. At this point, Bobby had to admit to himself that this was not a symptom of overworking. He was sick, like something was wrong with him. So he went to his doctor. But the doctor told him that despite what he was feeling, the symptoms were not that serious. Like it didn't appear that something was seriously wrong with him. And so ultimately, he just told Bobby to, go home and get more rest. That's what you need right now. So that's exactly what Bobby did. For the rest of that Saturday and all day the next day, Sunday, Bobby didn't do anything except lay in bed. But by that Sunday evening, Bobby still felt horrible. So he picked up the phone and did something that Bobby basically never did. He called one of his coworkers and told them that unfortunately, he would not be able to come to work tomorrow. When Bobby woke up the next morning, on Monday morning, the day he had taken off from work, he was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up on his own. His wife, Joanne, tried to help him get out of bed and go to the bathroom, but he was physically too heavy for her to lift. And so Joanne actually ended up calling Bobby's brother, David, to come over the house and help. But even with David there, who could now basically help move Bobby around the house, it was very clear to Bobby that whatever was happening to him was not some minor issue. Like this was serious, and it clearly was not going away with rest like the doctor had said it would. And so at some point that day, the family called an ambulance, which came and took Bobby to a nearby hospital. But by the time they got there, the pain in Bobby's legs had gotten so bad that Bobby was literally periodically screaming in pain, and he also had begun to vomit. But after several hours of nonstop pain and nonstop testing at the hospital doctors came into Bobby's room and they told him and his family that they actually had good news. They knew what was wrong with Bobby, and it was treatable. They diagnosed him with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a condition where the body's immune system attacks the nerves and causes tingling in the feet and hands. But the staff assured Bobby that all he needed was a very specific medication, and then he would feel a whole lot better. Bobby was incredibly relieved, as was his family, and that day he began taking the medication, and quickly his pain became tolerable, he stopped vomiting, and before long, he actually felt good enough that he was able to go home. It seemed like Bobby had really turned a corner here, and that everything really was going to be okay. But within just a few days of being back home again, Bobby's pain came back even worse than before, despite still taking this medication, and he also began experiencing a new symptom. His hair started falling out. On September 7th, so now a week and a half after Bobby came back from the hospital, well, he was back there again. And to Bobby's horror, this time, his doctors actually seemed kind of baffled by his symptoms. They told him that sudden extreme hair loss was definitely not a symptom of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So they told Bobby that it seemed like their initial diagnosis must have been wrong, despite the fact that the medication they gave him to treat GBS had helped him for a little while. And so the problem now was the doctors were basically at a total loss as to how to help Bobby. They really didn't know what was going on. And so for the next 9 days, doctors ran test after test on Bobby, and all the while, Bobby's pain intensified so much and became so constant that he basically fell into this almost delirious state, like the pain was completely too much. And then eventually, all these doctors who ran all these tests came back to Bobby and his family, and they just told them that we don't know what's wrong. Like, all these tests did not provide any clarity, and so basically we can't help you. And they told Bobby that now the only choice was he needed to be transferred to a bigger, more specialized medical facility in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles away from Wilkes-Barre. A few days later, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan walked down the hallway of the bigger hospital in Hershey, Pennsylvania. He was heading to the room where his patient, Bobby Curley, was staying. And even from several yards down the hallway, Dr. Brennan could already hear Bobby screaming and cursing at the nurses. Ever since Bobby had arrived at this hospital, his behavior had gotten more and more unhinged. At one point, Bobby had even thrown medical equipment across the room. And so now Dr. Brennan had to keep Bobby physically restrained to his bed. And so Dr. Brennan, when he reached Bobby's room, took a deep breath out in the hallway, and then into the room he walked. And inside, he saw Bobby strapped down to the bed, and he was screaming and thrashing around violently. And Dr. Brennan found himself just feeling awful about it. I mean, he felt really bad for Bobby. But really, he didn't know what to do for Bobby. He and his staff had tried basically everything they could think of to try to treat Bobby's pain, but nothing had worked. And so, on this day, Dr. Brennan couldn't do anything except what he normally did, which was just stand in Bobby's room sort of helplessly as Bobby screamed and flailed in pain. But on September 22nd, so 6 days after Bobby arrived in Hershey, he finally fell silent, because on that day, he slipped into a coma. 3 days later, Dr. Brennan felt very defeated as he stepped into Bobby's hospital room. There, he saw 5 members of Bobby's family: his wife Joanne, his 4-year-old stepdaughter Angela, Bobby's adult siblings Susan and David, and Bobby's elderly mother Mary. They'd all come to be with Bobby after he had fallen into this coma. Now, they looked up at Dr. Brennan expectantly. And Dr. Brennan, he took a deep breath, and he said he had some bad news. New test results had come back, and now, based on those results, they knew what was wrong with Bobby. Dr. Brennan told the family that what Bobby was suffering from was something called thallium toxicity. And when he said this, Dr. Brennan watched the family for some kind of a reaction. But the family just stared blankly at him like they had no idea what that meant. So Dr. Brennan went on and explained that thallium is an extremely toxic chemical. In fact, it can kill anyone who touches it, ingests it, or even just inhales its fumes. And he told them that, this is really unusual because thallium is highly controlled in the United States. It's actually banned in household products. So this is not a chemical that, Bobby just could have accidentally stumbled upon. This is pretty rare. And so at this point, Dr. Brennan just paused and let the family sit with this new information. And the family, they looked at each other like, wow, this is awful, but nobody knew how to react. They just kind of looked back at the doctor, waiting for him to explain more. But when the doctor didn't say anything, Bobby's sister, Susan, just asked in a quavering voice, what can we do? At that point, Dr. Brennan just shook his head and said, unfortunately, there's no cure for thallium poisoning. 2 days later, on September 27th, Joanne stood next to her unconscious husband in the hospital, and she nodded at the medical staff that was gathered all around him. It was ultimately Joanne's decision whether or not to keep Bobby on life support. But with no hope of a cure, Joanne had ultimately decided that the best thing to do was to take him off life support. And so after giving the signal to medical staff, Joanne, her daughter, and the rest of Bobby's family, they kind of stepped back from the bed, and they watched as the staff walked over and removed Bobby's ventilator. And then Joanne had to watch as her husband took his final breath. On the evening of October 21st, 1991, so about a month after Bobby died from thallium poisoning, a police detective named Harold Cawley sat at a big table with 7 other men inside of a steakhouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The other men were a mixture of coroners and investigators from all across Pennsylvania. Some were from the Hershey area, where Bobby had died. The rest, like Cawley, worked for the police in Wilkes-Barre, where Bobby had lived. The men were there discussing the investigation into Bobby's death, and they had been doing this for the past 3 hours already, because there really was so much to talk about. They had already covered Bobby's initial autopsy results, which showed that he had a staggering 900 times the lethal limit of thallium in his system when he died. And so they were working under the assumption that Bobby must have been poisoned by a single massive dose of thallium, whether accidentally or on purpose, they didn't know. And so they discussed theories for how this could have even happened to him. Because remember, thallium is not just a chemical you can get from the store. This is something that is highly regulated. So how did he come in contact with it? Their first thought had been basically what everybody else suspected, which was, Bobby must have been accidentally poisoned at the Wilkes University chemistry lab where he'd been working for so many months. And they actually had a bunch of records from a preliminary examination of the lab. And according to these records, one of the first things investigators had found inside of that lab was 5 vials of thallium in one of the storerooms. They'd also found a rag that was laying out on a countertop that presumably was there when Bobby first arrived and he and his crew began cleaning everything up. And next to this rag was a handwritten note that had a warning on it that literally said, "Thallium wiping rag, touch me and die." The rag had actually caused a huge amount of panic amongst the investigators when they had gone in to begin sweeping the lab for signs of thallium, because people were fearful that maybe they'd brushed up against it and touched this rag, and were they going to get thallium poisoning? However, they actually tested the rag and it came back negative for thallium, as did all the surfaces in the lab and also the air in the lab. And so the investigators had finally decided that that note must have been a joke or something. Also, the university insisted that all of its thallium was accounted for, meaning none of it could have been, stolen or misused in some way to poison Bobby because they would know about it. And so at this point, the university had actually been sort of ruled out as where Bobby got poisoned, which really didn't make sense to Detective Cawley or the other investigators at this dinner, because again, thallium is hard to come by. The idea that Bobby was working in a lab that contained thallium, but that wasn't where he was poisoned by thallium, seemed almost impossible. It had to have happened there. But they had gone out and tested all of Bobby's coworkers who had also worked in that lab with Bobby for so many days and so many hours, and they all came back negative for thallium exposure. However, Bobby's own family, his wife Joanne and her 4-year-old daughter Angela, they had tested positive for thallium exposure. Granted, it was on a near microscopic level because any amount of exposure could actually be lethal, and those two were okay, so obviously they had not received a lethal dose. But there were very small traces of thallium in both of them, which was odd. And so everybody at the table agreed that the right thing to do here was to speak to Joanne and see if maybe she had some ideas of how she and her daughter and obviously Bobby could have maybe come in contact with this very rare and lethal chemical. And then also, they need to get inside of the family's duplex to search it, literally, for thallium. But first, there was the problem of jurisdiction. Bobby had died in Hershey, but he'd gotten sick in Wilkes-Barre. So, after some discussion, the men decided that the Wilkes-Barre police should be the ones to head up the case because that is where Bobby actually got poisoned. The next day, Detective Cawley invited Bobby's siblings, David and Suzanne, to the Wilkes-Barre police station. And right away, it was quite clear that both of them were very suspicious of Bobby's wife, Joanne. They told Cawley that Joanne had been acting really strange for months, both before and also after Bobby's death. David said when his brother had first gotten sick, Joanne had barely lifted a finger to help him. She'd called David to come over and look after Bobby, acting like she needed somebody strong enough to move Bobby around, which was true. But while David was upstairs literally carrying Bobby to and from the bathroom, Joanne stayed downstairs with her daughter and totally ignored them. She didn't even pretend to want to help. She basically let David do all of it. And Susan said, even though she didn't know for sure, her impression of Joanne right after she had taken Bobby off life support and he's died, her impression of Joanne was she was hugely relieved. Cawley listened and nodded and sort of gave the impression that he was following along and basically believed them. But inside, he wasn't really convinced that what they were describing was highly suspicious behavior. When David came over to help Bobby, that was because she had asked him to do that, after trying at first unsuccessfully to move her husband around. And then when David was there, she does have a 4-year-old daughter. She can't just leave her unsupervised. Or maybe she doesn't want her daughter to see Bobby, and so she has to keep her downstairs. So there's like an explanation for that. And as for Joanne being relieved after her husband's death, everybody dealt with grief differently. And Bobby's death had been a really traumatic, drawn-out process for everybody involved. So maybe she was relieved, but not because she was happy about it. It could have just been the end of a nightmare chapter in all of their lives. And so after he had listened to their concerns, Cawley began to redirect the conversation, and he began asking David and Susan about their relationship with Bobby. They both said they were very close with their brother, even as adults. They said they lived nearby, and they saw each other quite a bit. David in particular said he spent a lot of time with Bobby. He said they often went fishing, and recently, together, they had renovated Bobby's kitchen. And this caught Cawley's attention, because it sounded like David and Bobby had finished this renovation project around the same time that Bobby first got sick. Cawley didn't know if this was relevant or not, but it was interesting. So at the end of their discussion, he just thanked David and Susan for all the information and told them they were free to go. A few days later, on the morning of October 25th, 1991, Detective Cawley and 3 other investigators sat at an interrogation table in the Wilkes-Barre police station, right across from Joanne Curley, and the lawyer that she had brought along with her. Cawley didn't know what to make of Joanne yet. Obviously, she and her daughter had also been exposed to thallium, so that could mean that they too accidentally were exposed to this chemical, same as Bobby, but obviously on a much smaller scale because they lived. Or they could have also been the target of somebody trying to poison this family, and ultimately just Bobby was killed from this poisoning. Or Joanne could be the poisoner. She could have poisoned her own husband. Bobby's siblings are talking about how awful Joanne was acting towards her husband in the wake of his illness. Maybe she poisoned him. And in doing so, she accidentally exposed herself and her daughter. Basically, Cawley couldn't tell yet if Joanne was a victim or a perpetrator. So he made sure to watch her very carefully while another investigator began asking her to explain how and when her husband first got sick. Joanne said that Bobby had been complaining about feeling pretty run down for what felt like weeks or maybe even months, but he hadn't had any major symptoms until a week before his hospitalization in August. And she said that much like Bobby, she had just kind of chalked it up to he had been overworking, or maybe he had some standard illness that would just go away with rest, like that first doctor had said. She said that she had never even heard of thallium, and really at no point had it ever crossed her mind that maybe Bobby had been poisoned by thallium. As Colley listened to Joanne tell this story, he was struck by a couple of things. First of all, Joanne said Bobby had been feeling pretty run down for a while before his death. This seemed to conflict with investigators' assumption that a single massive dose of thallium had sent Bobby to the hospital and ultimately killed him. It seemed more likely, based on what Joanne said, that this poisoning happened over a period of time. And the second thing Colley was struck by was actually just Joanne's general demeanor. She had just recounted in detail, the story of her husband dying, this awful, awful death. Thallium poisoning is a horrible way to die. And as she's describing it, she's not shedding a single tear or really acting at all like she's even upset about it. And so at this point, Colley was beginning to wonder if maybe Susan and David had been right about Joanne. She really did not seem to care much about her husband's death. And so what Colley did is he stopped the other investigator and he leaned forward and he just asked Joanne point blank, "How do you explain how you and your daughter were exposed to thallium?" And immediately, Joanne had a story, a bizarre one. She said Bobby really liked to drink iced tea when he was at work. So every morning, she would fill his thermos up from this big pitcher of pre-made iced tea that she kept in their fridge. And so Bobby would take that thermos with him to work and he would drink the tea all day and then come home with the thermos. And some days when he would come back, Bobby had not drank all the iced tea. There'd be some left inside the thermos. And so Joanne said what she would do in that case was she would take the remaining iced tea still in the thermos and she would pour it back into the pitcher in the fridge, basically to salvage what was left of the tea. And she said she and her daughter also drank from that pitcher. So in essence, she sometimes was drinking from the same tea that Bobby was drinking from directly. And so perhaps in that way, if he was being exposed to thallium, maybe it was getting into that tea that he was bringing home. And, she believed that maybe that was how she was being exposed, by drinking the leftover iced tea. Colley glanced over at the other investigators in the room, and they all looked as baffled as he was. This iced tea explanation was pretty out there, but it was so weirdly specific that they really couldn't write it off. And Colley knew that, if the iced tea theory was legitimate, it might be able to explain why all three people in this family, all living in the same place, had such drastically different levels of exposure. Basically, Bobby could be having this huge exposure to thallium outside the house, and then basically remnants of the thallium exposure are finding their way back into that leftover tea, so it's a really small amount of thallium. That's coming back home, it's being mixed inside that pitcher, and so when Joanne and her daughter are drinking from that pitcher, they're only getting a very small amount of thallium. And so again, it's out there, but it would explain it. So Colley asked Joanne if he had her permission to not just search her whole duplex to check for thallium, but specifically check her fridge, check her pitcher, her iced tea pitcher, and all the thermoses that Bobby brought to work to see if there was still trace levels of thallium inside of them. And he was worried when he asked her this question that she might refuse or give some reason that she couldn't, but Joanne immediately agreed without any hesitation. That same afternoon, Colley, his investigators, and a crime scene unit arrived at the Curleys' duplex to begin their search. Colley looked on as the crime scene unit entered the duplex and immediately began scouring every surface. And they found absolutely no trace of thallium anywhere in the house, except for in one very specific location. The thermos Joanne had already told them about, the one that Bobby would bring with the iced tea in it to work and then back again. Traces of thallium were found on the little ridges at the top of the thermos where the lid screwed back on. And this was huge, not only because now they had the first clear sign of exactly where the thallium was coming in and out of Bobby's life, but more specifically because it was at the top of this cup that obviously Bobby is drinking from. This showed that the way the thallium wound up in Bobby's system was because he ingested it. That was something they didn't know at this point. Now it seems very clear that's how it happened. But despite this revelation, it didn't explain how Joanne and Angela were also exposed, because when they tested the big pitcher of iced tea in the fridge, it didn't contain any thallium. And also, just finding the thallium at the top of the thermos didn't explain how it actually got there. But for Colley, what really stood out about finding thallium on this thermos was that this item, this thermos, is something Bobby took to work and home every single day. So it seemed like maybe, Colley and his staff had been too quick to rule out where Bobby was working. I mean, he was working in a chemical lab that contained thallium, and they had ruled that out as the place where he could have been poisoned. Now, it seemed like they needed to take another look. Seven months later, in late May of 1992, Detective Colley sat at his desk, thumbing through the notes from all the interviews and polygraph tests that he and his team had carried out since the previous October. One by one, they had brought in all of Bobby's coworkers and grilled them about Bobby's death. And all of the coworkers had more or less said the same thing. Bobby was well liked, and nobody they knew would want to harm him. Some of the coworkers did admit that they did like to prank each other a lot, but they said the pranks had always been, pretty harmless, and spiking somebody's drinks with chemicals was way, way beyond anything they ever did. At least that's what all of them said. But two of Bobby's coworkers, Sammy DePasquale and Robert Marconi, had failed their polygraph exams. In fact, the polygraph examiner said those two had literally gotten the worst scores he had ever seen. So very quickly, those two shot to the top of Colley's suspect list. And so Colley had pressed both of them about whether or not they had pranked Bobby by putting thallium into his thermos. Maybe they didn't know how dangerous thallium was, but did they put something in his thermos? And they said absolutely not, they didn't do that. But Colley didn't believe them, because he'd already heard about previous pranks that involved swapping out coworkers' drinks for things like tobacco spit. So what's to say they didn't put thallium in Bobby's thermos? It just sort of tracked. The problem was, Colley didn't have any actual evidence that he could use to arrest either of them, especially since the university continued to insist that none of their thallium was missing from the lab. Now, Colley knew it was possible the university was wrong, that maybe there was unaccounted for thallium, but he had no way to prove that. Colley also felt pretty suspicious of Joanne and also Bobby's own brother, David. Joanne, for obvious reasons, was still suspicious. She had thallium in her system. She seemed oddly detached from Bobby when he was dying, kind of letting other people take care of him, and apparently was relieved when he was taken off life support. But even if Joanne had wanted to poison Bobby, it was really unclear how she would have gotten her hands on thallium. And then as for David, the reason he was sort of suspicious to Colley is because he spent a lot of time with Bobby. And he also did that kitchen renovation with him. And so there's all these moments where he's alone, potentially handling chemicals with Bobby before he got sick. So basically, David had the opportunity to poison Bobby, but there really was no motive. And just like with Joanne, Colley felt like, where would David get the thallium? That was the big question. Where is the thallium coming from? And so at this point, Detective Colley was basically at a dead end and just did not know how to take this case, which was heartbreaking because earlier that day, he'd been informed that the district attorney had decided to actually shut down the investigation into Bobby's death. The case was officially cold. And so since Colley could not revive it, all he could do was close the case file and stick it in a drawer. One morning in August of 1994, so more than 2 years after the investigation into Bobby's death was shut down, Detective Colley walked up the porch steps of the duplex where Bobby had lived, and he knocked on the door. Colley had been thinking a lot about this case recently, and today he was hoping that Bobby's widow, Joanne, would help him take one last shot at cracking it. A moment later, Joanne answered the door, and once the look of surprise left her face, she invited the detective inside. Colley quickly explained to her that the reason he was here is because there had been this technological breakthrough in toxicology testing. The Wilkes-Barre police were now able to perform a new type of test that had not been available to them 3 years ago when her husband had died. And Colley believed that, this information they could get would help them figure out what actually happened to Bobby once and for all. Joanne's eyes lit up at this news, and she was about to open her mouth to reply, but Colley quickly added there was actually a catch. He said in order to do these tests, they would have to exhume Bobby's body, and the only person who could give investigators permission to do that was Joanne. Colley waited while Joanne processed everything she had just been told. He tried not to let it show on his face, but Joanne's response to this would basically decide the entire fate of this case. If she said no, there really was nothing they could do. The evidence contained inside of Bobby's casket would be lost to them forever, which meant if somebody had intentionally poisoned Bobby, they would never figure out who it was, and so the killer would never be brought to justice. But unsurprisingly, Joanne said yes, of course. Later that month, on August 23rd, Colley went to the cemetery where Bobby was buried, and he watched as a backhoe dug up his grave and pulled his casket out of the ground. The police and coroner then took custody of Bobby's body, and they would go on to perform these new toxicology tests. And when the results came in, they gave Colley the exact information he had hoped for. Based on the police investigation, and critically, those new toxicology tests, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bobby Curley. The first time the killer slipped thallium into Bobby's thermos, Bobby was busy working in another room and didn't notice, which was exactly what the killer wanted. The killer did not hate Bobby. In fact, they really hadn't wanted to kill him until he had started talking about opening up his own business with that settlement money his family was going to get. And the killer just could not let that happen. Because if Bobby went into business for himself, he would ruin everything. The killer believed that by poisoning Bobby one time, that would kill him, and then all their problems would be solved. But the next day, Bobby actually seemed fine, sort of unfazed by the poison. So the next time the killer got the chance, they added a little more poison to Bobby's thermos. And when Bobby again stayed healthy the next day, well, the killer just added a little bit more the next time, and they just kept on doing that. They were afraid that if they added too much at once, Bobby might notice, and then they would get caught. So, for months, Bobby was being poisoned, but didn't really show any significant symptoms. But finally, in August of 1991, Bobby started showing really severe symptoms. Remember, his legs were in extreme pain, his hands were going numb, and when he called in sick to work on that Monday, that was when the killer knew. They were certain they had finished him off. Except they hadn't finished him off. Because when he went to the hospital, Bobby just continued to cling to life. So the killer actually went to visit Bobby in the hospital. And while Bobby was sleeping, the killer slipped a final massive amount of the poison into a soda cup that Bobby kept by his bedside. And when Bobby woke up, the killer kind of casually encouraged him to drink the soda. And Bobby did so without any hesitation because Bobby had no reason not to trust the killer. Because the killer was his own wife, Joanne Curley. She had actually started poisoning him almost a year before she actually murdered him, but investigators didn't realize this until a new type of toxicology test allowed them to figure out exactly when Bobby was being poisoned. This test worked by analyzing some of the hairs that Bobby still had left on his body. Basically, every time Bobby was poisoned, a chemical marker was left behind in his hair. So as his hair grew out, the strands sort of became timelines that showed exactly when he had been poisoned. And when Colley, through these tests, discovered that Bobby had been poisoned multiple times between October 1990 and September of 1991, these dates ruled out Bobby's coworkers and his brother David. The poisoning had simply started too early for David to be responsible and went on far too long for his coworkers to be guilty. But the timeline clearly ruled in Joanne. And when police began digging into why Joanne might have wanted to kill her husband, they realized she'd convinced Bobby to make her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy just days before poisoning him for the very first time. And so Joanne's motive was money. She did not want Bobby to have any of that financial windfall she was going to get from the death of her earlier husband, the wrongful death lawsuit where she was going to get $1 million, even though she kind of acted like, oh yeah, Bobby's going to use some of that to start his business. She didn't want that. She did not want him to have any of it. That was her money. So that was one motivation financially, and the other financial motivation was by killing Bobby, she would also receive the life insurance payout. As for where Joanne actually got the thallium, she would admit that she had used an old container of rat poison that did contain thallium that was manufactured in the US before thallium was banned in household products. On December 12, 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Joanne ultimately pled guilty and so was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. She would wind up serving all 20 years and was released from prison in 2016.